July 18, 1945. Late afternoon. The air inside the American command offices in Potsdam was heavy with heat and consequence. Outside, Europe lay in ruins. Inside, a single sentence altered the course of history. The war planners spoke carefully. Their voices were steady, professional. They had refined their estimates, adjusted their maps, and recalculated resistance. An invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would not be swift, it would not be clean, it would be catastrophic. The number was placed before the president. 1 million American casualties. Not spoken dramatically, not emphasized, simply delivered as fact. Harry S. Truman did not respond immediately. He did not argue the arithmetic. He did not challenge the assumptions. He did not ask how the number had been reached. Instead, his attention drifted away from the paper and towards something unseen, faces that would never appear in any report. Farm boys from Missouri, factory workers from Ohio, teenagers who still wrote home asking about their dogs, their sweethearts, their mother's cooking. Men who would land on beaches under artillery fire and never stand again. Men who would scream for medics who could not reach them. To Truman, the figure was not strategic, it was personal. The war against Japan had already devoured entire cities. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was taken at a cost that shocked even hardened generals. On Okinawa alone, more than 12,000 Americans were dead. Japanese military and civilian losses were measured in the hundreds of thousands, and Okinawa was only a prelude. The invasion plan envisioned 2 massive landings, one in November 1945, another in the spring of 1946. Millions of troops, thousands of ships, endless waves of wounded. Truman understood something that could not be written into briefing papers. This was no longer a question of victory. Victory was assured. The question was how many would be sacrificed after the outcome was already decided. He later wrote that the decision weighed on him day and night. But in that room on that afternoon, there was no rhetoric, no grand speech, only a quiet reckoning. If the war continued, the killing would continue, and it would not stop on its own. To understand the weight of that moment, one had to understand how Harry Truman arrived there at all. Only 82 days earlier, on April 12, 1945, Truman had been vice president for just 87 days when the call came. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. The longest presidency in American history ended abruptly in a warm room in Warm Springs, Georgia. By nightfall, Truman stood in the Oval Office, sworn in, stunned, and dangerously uninformed. He had not been briefed on the Manhattan Project. He had not been included in the deepest strategic debates of the war. He inherited not only the presidency, but the command of a global conflict still raging across 2 oceans. By the summer of 1945, Germany was defeated. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. But Japan fought on, isolated, bombed, starving, yet unyielding. American intelligence painted a grim picture. Japanese cities were burning under conventional bombing. Entire urban districts had been erased by firestorms. Yet, there was no sign of surrender. Intercepted communications revealed preparations for mass civilian resistance. School children were being trained with bamboo spears. Civilians were instructed to die rather than submit. The Japanese leadership was divided, but paralysis favored continuation. The military factions still believed that inflicting enough casualties would force a negotiated peace. They did not need to win, they only needed to make victory unbearably expensive.
Truman's advisors laid out the options with brutal clarity. A naval blockade would starve Japan into submission, but at the cost of millions of Japanese civilians and thousands of Allied prisoners. Continued bombing would devastate cities without guaranteeing surrender. An invasion would force a decision, but only through blood. And then there was the weapon Truman had only recently learned existed: a single bomb, unprecedented in power, untested in war. It was not presented to him as a triumph, it was presented as a dilemma. The generals spoke in probabilities, casualty ranges, timelines, political implications. But Truman's mind returned again and again to one fact: every additional month of war meant more telegrams delivered to front porches across America. He remembered his own service in the First World War, the mud, the fear, the randomness of death. He was not a career general insulated by abstraction. He had worn the uniform. He knew what numbers concealed. In his private notes, he wrote that the decision was the hardest thing I ever had to do, but there was no council that could share the burden. The authority and the responsibility rested with him alone. This was not about revenge. It was not about spectacle. It was about ending a war that had consumed entire continents. And whatever choice he made, history would never allow him to step away from it. By late July, the pressure intensified. Potsdam, Germany, July 26, 1945. The Allied leaders issued a declaration to Japan. It demanded unconditional surrender. It warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. It offered no guarantees for the emperor, no assurances that the old order would survive. Tokyo's response was silence. Behind that silence, debate raged. Some Japanese officials searched desperately for Soviet mediation. Others prepared for annihilation. The military tightened its grip, convinced that sacrifice itself was strategy. Death, they believed, could still shape the outcome.
Across the Pacific, American preparations continued as if invasion were inevitable. Purple Heart medals were manufactured in staggering numbers, so many that decades later they would still be issued from that same stock. Field hospitals were planned, grave registrations expanded. The machinery of loss was being oiled in advance. Truman read reports late into the night. He absorbed cables from commanders who had seen what no surrender meant in practice. On Saipan, civilians had leapt from cliffs. In Okinawa, families detonated grenades rather than be captured. This was not theoretical resistance, it was absolute. Some advisors urged patience. Japan was weakened, they argued. Starvation and bombing would eventually break its will. Others warned that delay meant Soviet entry into the Pacific War, reshaping Asia's future in ways the United States could not control. The atomic weapon sat at the center of every discussion, even when not named. It represented speed, finality, and ending. Truman visited his diary again. He did not write about glory. He did not write about dominance. He wrote about responsibility. I have told the Sec of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it, he noted, so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target, and not women and children. Even then, the moral boundary was already eroding under reality. There were no illusions. This was not a clean solution. It was a brutal one. But in Truman's calculation, it was the only option left that did not guarantee even greater slaughter. He imagined the alternative future clearly: American troops fighting through Kyushu, then Honshu, street by street, hill by hill, months of carnage stretching into another year. He also understood something colder, something political. If the war dragged on, every death would belong to him. The public would not blame projections or plans. They would blame the man who chose not to act. The decision narrowed. Time collapsed. The paths forward are reduced to two, and only one of them promised an end. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. Hiroshima time.
From 31,000 feet above the city, the decision left Truman's hands forever. He was at sea aboard the USS Augusta, returning from Potsdam when the confirmation arrived. The message was brief, controlled, almost antiseptic. The bomb had worked. The target had been destroyed. Truman went silent. In Hiroshima, a single flash erased a city. Temperatures surged beyond comprehension. Buildings collapsed inward. Shadows burned into stone. Tens of thousands were dead within minutes. Many more would follow in hours and days, their injuries beyond the reach of medicine. There would be no invasion of Kyushu that November, but the war did not end. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The same morning, Soviet forces poured into Manchuria, shattering Japan's last diplomatic illusion. The vice closed. Military resistance still flickered, but the logic of sacrifice finally broke under the weight of reality. Inside the Japanese leadership, the debate turned violent. Officers spoke of coups. Assassination was whispered as duty. Even now, surrender was seen as dishonor worse than death. It took the emperor himself to intervene. On August 14th, Hirohito recorded a message to his people. His voice, unheard by the public until that moment, told them the war must end. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. He did not speak of defeat, but the meaning was unmistakable. When Truman heard the news, there was no celebration, only relief. He later told associates that he had never lost sleep over the decision, but not because it was easy, because the alternative had been unbearable. He believed with absolute conviction that he had spared countless young Americans from dying on foreign soil, screaming for their mothers, far from home. Criticism came swiftly. It would never stop. Scientists protested. Allies questioned. History itself would argue endlessly over necessity and morality. But in August 1945, Truman did not see abstraction. He saw a war that was finally over, and an invasion that would never happen. The aftermath unfolded quietly, almost deceptively so. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender was signed. The signatures were careful. The ceremony was brief. No speeches of triumph, no declarations of vengeance. The war that had killed more than 60 million people ended with pens scratching paper on a gray morning. Power shifted instantly. Japan's empire dissolved. Its military was dismantled. The emperor remained, but transformed from divine ruler to constitutional symbol. An entire civilization recalibrated itself under occupation, rebuilding from ash and silence. For the United States, victory carried an unfamiliar weight. The nation emerged not merely as a military power, but as a custodian of unprecedented force. The atomic age had begun, and there would be no return to innocence. Every future conflict would be fought under the shadow of what had been unleashed. Truman returned to Washington bearing both success and solitude. He had won the war. He had also inherited its moral reckoning. He refused to apologize. He refused to dramatize. He spoke of duty. Again and again he returned to the same justification. Not ideology, not dominance. Lives. I thought of the boys in uniform, he later said, and I decided I would do everything I could to save them.
History would fracture around that sentence. Some would argue that alternatives existed. Others would insist the decision was inevitable. Scholars would debate casualty projections, diplomatic timing, and the role of Soviet entry. None of them would sit in that chair in July 1945, holding responsibility without precedent. What mattered, in the end, was not whether the decision was pure, it was that it was final.
The bombs ended one war and inaugurated a new era, one defined by deterrence, fear, and restraint born of memory. Leaders after Truman would measure their choices against his, aware that certain decisions reshape the world in ways no victory parade can celebrate. For Truman himself, the war ended not with applause, but with quiet resolve. He believed the burden had been his to carry, and his alone. And once carried, it could never be set down.